All right, we're going to talk about adaptations. Again, these are in your notes. We're going to go through and just do a small chunk. When you're done, please load up your Google form if you feel prepared and take the little Google form quiz. I will be checking for completion. So, adaptations. Here we go. Adaptations. So, reproduction is two different types, asexual and sexual. All right. Now, what you have to understand is that asexual reproduction is usually like making clones. It's actually where the idea of cloning came from. So it occurs in body cells, or what we call somatic cells, different things like bacteria and plants and jellyfish. It requires less energy, and all of the offspring, like I said, are identical. This is an example of budding, where it grew an identical copy and it fell off, and it was exactly the same. Sexual reproduction, though, is occurring only in animals and plants, and it only happens to our sex cells. It completely makes everything genetically different due to the way that things assort and cross over, which is a Bio-30 concept, which we'll talk about when you come to Bio-30. But essentially, sexual reproduction is what creates genetic variation. Asexual reproduction is much like mitosis, which you may remember from grade 9 science, and sexual reproduction is meiosis because of the sex cells. So, this is the process of mitosis, and this is the process of meiosis. Again, get these things in your notes as you follow along. Please pause if you need to. So we talk about these because we want to know what is important about sexual reproduction. Where is it leading? So asexual reproduction, like I said, makes an identical clone, but all species have to produce offspring in order to pass on genetic information. So reproduction is essential to survival of any species. This is where this idea of adaptations will come into play. So how does this work? Well, when we pass on our genetic information, we're passing on genes. These provide your characteristics, such as height and hair color. Okay, these happen to be assorted and given to you when gametes meet and fertilization occurs. Asexual reproduction is, again, the offspring is identical to parents. We're not really going to talk a ton about that, but I just put it in there as a reminder. Sexual reproduction is the different combinations of genes, and it makes variation. Variation is different characteristics. Its variation is why you and your siblings don't look alike, or why you don't look identical to your parents. So, what are some of your adaptations? Essentially, you are different than anyone else, right? Your variation is all over the place. You could be blonde hair, brown eyes, blue eyes. You could have lots and lots of variation, okay? But what we're going to talk specifically about is adaptations. So adaptations are the structure and the behavior and the physiological processes that help you or any organism survive to reproduce in a particular environment, okay? You are the way you are because of genetic information, but adaptations allow you to survive. So we call this the fit of an organism. So how do they survive in their environment? So if you think about the giraffe, for example, a giraffe did not always have a long neck. Its neck actually stretched out over time as it had to eat plants that were higher and higher and higher. Now, it didn't stretch out because it just wanted to. It had to adapt to its environment. As trees' leaves grew higher and higher and they didn't have food near the ground, the ones that had longer necks tended to survive, reproduce, and pass on their genetics. It wasn't just magical. These were the ones that survived, okay? In fact, a giraffe has the same amount of vertebrae in its neck that you do. So in this long, beautiful neck, 7 vertebrae, okay? So the structure is very similar to ours, but it adapted to fit its environment. So we use adaptations as a way to survive. So camouflage, vision and talons, leathery leaves, hibernation, all of these things are used as ways to adapt to your environment to ensure that you can live. So for example, the hair being white in the winter makes a heck of a lot more sense than the brown because you can see brown. You can then find them and eat them. It's easier to blend in with the white. So adaptations and variations. Adaptations are very gradual, though. So when I talked about the giraffe, you have to remember it wasn't like one day the giraffe had a long neck because the day before all the short neck giraffes died out. This happened over an extended period of time. So it's very gradual change. These are all related to the fact that we pass on genes that allow for these adaptations to happen. So let's define the difference. Variation is a visible or invisible difference in a population. Okay? When we call a variation visible, we call it its phenotype. And when it's invisible, we call it its genotype. So when you have variation, it helps an individual survive and is passed on and throughout the generations, and it becomes more and more common. Okay? Variation becomes the trait of that population. So all variations can provide an advantage, a disadvantage, or no effect at all. Sometimes you can have positive change, negative change, or nothing gets changed at all. So genetic variation in a population is due to the variety of genetic information in all individuals of the population. So if you look at mom and dad here, okay, you'll notice that the genetic variation of their pups is very different because dad and mom each donate half of their chromosomes to create the individuals seen here. So sometimes genetic variation can also arise due to mutations. So genetic material, or DNA, can spontaneously and start dividing and doing crazy things if it's something like cancer. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about when DNA is copied, sometimes it's not copied 100% correctly, okay? So this leads to genetic variation. Your own DNA has about 175 mutations that wasn't present in your parents' DNA. Okay, this is because when DNA was copied, it wasn't 100% exact. Why? Because there's billions and billions of nucleotides that need to be copied, and it's not going to be perfect. Okay, now the downfall is sometimes those mutations can be very dangerous, but most of the times they're not even noticed at all. Okay. We also can have mutations due to the fact that mutagens, things like X-rays and UV radiations, cause problems to the DNA, and the DNA then mutates and is passed on through generations. So why are we talking about mutations? Well, if a mutation happens in any place else other than the body cell, okay, then it passes on to the progeny. But if a mutation happens in your body cell, such as your skin, it disappears when you die. Okay, you're not passing your skin cells on to anyone. There's nothing in there that is going to be genetically copied. If it happens to your skin, it dies with you, sort of thing. But if it alters your gametes, so sperm or eggs, then it is possible that that mutation may be passed on to your offspring. Again, there's no guarantees because the process of meiosis causes random assortment of different genes into different cells. So it could happen, but it may not. So that is adaptations. Again, go back, pause where needed, put it in your notes, make sure you have all your notes filled out. I'm checking them tomorrow before you are allowed to work on your project. If your notes are not filled out, you're not working on your project, you need to do your notes. So I will see you all tomorrow.